Well, it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here to help celebrate EMWA's centennial. It's a tough act to follow the Surgeon General of the United States, but it's also inspiring because what I want to speak to you about is an area where I think prevention is very important and culture change is very important for the health of our nation's youth. So as was mentioned, I am at the National Institutes of Health, which is, as you know, the largest source of funding for biomedical research in the world. And National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism is one of the 27 institutes and centers that comprise the NIH. And so at NIAAA, we deal with one simple, single substance, alcohol, and its effects across the lifespan. And alcohol has differential effects depending on when the exposure occurs, the duration of exposure, the timing, and the intensity of exposure, as well as the pattern of drinking. And it has very different effects depending on the fetus, child, adolescent, senior. So tonight I'm going to focus on adolescent and young adults. And it's important to note that alcohol problems affect a huge number of people in this country. Over 16.5 million people suffer with an alcohol use disorder. And alcohol misuse, so that not only includes alcohol use disorders, but that includes the problems and the consequences of underage drinking, and the problems and consequences of exposing a fetus to alcohol when still in the womb costs an estimated $223 billion a year. And of that, $27 billion is attributed to underage drinking. Just to put that in perspective, our budget at NIAAA to deal with this, as well as all the problems of alcohol abuse across the age span, is about $500 million, just a little under that. So we know that more young people use alcohol than any other substance, be it tobacco, marijuana, any illicit drugs. And we know that during adolescence, both any alcohol use and binge drinking, which is 5 or more drinks on an occasion, ramps up dramatically. And it's interesting because adolescents drink less often than adults. They drink about 5.5 days per month compared with about 9 days a month for adults. But when they drink about twice as much per occasion as an adult. And you're looking in this graph at kids 12 to 20. So if you took out the 12, 13, 14-year-olds, that's a lot of alcohol being consumed on one occasion. Now the good news, and there is good news, we're happy to report there is good news, that the prevalence of drinking and binge drinking among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders is actually decreasing. The bad news is not so much for girls. So the decrease seems to be in the heavy drinking by males, but females somehow think it's empowering to be able to drink like the guys. So as you see, as the alcohol use by males comes down and the alcohol use by females seems pretty flat, there's a convergence in the prevalence of girls who are drinking. It's like, I don't think we want our girls to be like boys in that sense. I don't think that's empowering. And the decline is also seen in the older age groups among males, but again, not among females. And there are unique risks for women who drink alcohol to excess at all ages. And you can see on this list, there's a host of them, but the one that's particularly pertinent to this age group is with pregnancy. Because these adolescent and young adult girls and women are at childbearing age, we know that about 70% of first pregnancies are unplanned. And we know that alcohol exposure, especially in those very early stages of pregnancy, can have devastating effects, lifelong effects, effects on cognitive abilities, effects on behavior. And so before a woman even knows she's pregnant, you've got this heavy drinking culture, and you've got kids being exposed in the womb to alcohol. We also know that many young people are engaged in what we call high-intensity drinking. So when we talk to college students and we say binge drinking is 5 or more drinks on an occasion in about a 2-hour period, they look at you like you're crazy and they go, that's what we call preloading. That's what we do before we go out to a party to drink. And we know that This graph just shows for 12th graders. So these are seniors in high school. These are not college students, which are even heavier drinking, but we don't have as good a data for college students right now. But we know that about 8% of 12th graders tell us that they have had 10 or more drinks in the past 2 weeks. And a little under 4.5% have had 15 or more, in a 2-hour period. So high-intensity drinking has its consequences, and one of these consequences is memory blackouts. Now, when we say blackouts, a lot of people think you mean passed out, unconscious, kind of face down on the sidewalk. But actually, a memory blackout happens when you're actually functional and may appear completely functional to someone around you, especially if that person's had a little bit to drink. But you appear functional, but you're not forming any memories about what's going on. So the next day, you will have no idea where you were or what you did. Now, I don't know about you, but I have a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old, and that scares me to death. And it's interesting, this young man's kind of the example. Males kind of have a swagger about it that, this is par for the course, and kind of wonder what I did to the world. Females have a different reaction. Their thought is, I wonder what the world did to me. And when about 800 college students were surveyed about blackouts, about 40% said that they'd had at least one blackout in the past year. 9% said they'd had a blackout in the past 2 weeks. And similarly, when recent graduates of high school who were getting ready to start their freshman year, so over the summer, were asked the same question, about 12% said, yeah, I blacked out in the past 2 weeks. The other indication that high-intensity drinking is still a problem is we're seeing a rise in emergency department visits and hospitalizations related to alcohol use. So the triangles are the older age group, the 18 to 24-year-olds, and the diamonds are the 12 to 17-year-olds. And what you see is the rate of emergency department visits has remained constant over the last few years for the younger age group. And yet females are engaging the emergency department at the same rates as guys for alcohol overdoses. And in the older age group, the actual emergency department visits are going up. And the rise is steeper for females than for males. Similarly, we see this for hospitalizations, actually being admitted to the hospital for an alcohol-related injury. And this is not just having alcohol on board, this is an injury related to consumption of alcohol, including alcohol poisonings. And again, we see the rates going up for the older age group. So in addition to hospitalizations, emergency department visits, blackouts, you also have an estimated 5,000 deaths of youth under the age of 21. And less than half of those are auto accidents. And the one that's really striking to me is the alcohol poisoning, falls, burns, and drownings. So we don't think so much about that, but we read about the stories of the kid who falls out of the 3rd floor of a fraternity house, about the kid who is walking home from a party, stumbles and drowns in 6 inches of water. It's also related to sexual assaults. Prevention of student sexual assault is a major task force in the White House now. How do we prevent this? Well, if we leave alcohol out of that discussion, then we're not going to solve the problem. And then there's also the link between early alcohol use and future dependence. So we know that when people are asked as adults, when did you start drinking? Those who respond they started to use alcohol before the age of 15 are 4 times more likely to also describe their drinking in a way that meets the criteria for alcohol use disorder. And there are also the secondhand effects. And some of these secondhand effects, again, an estimated 696,000 college students report that they've been assaulted by another student who's been drinking each year. An estimated 97,000 college students are victims of alcohol-related sexual assault and date rape. And we also know that those people who experience violence are more likely to have symptoms of PTSD, and those people who have PTSD are more likely to have alcohol use disorder problems, and that's harder to treat when you have those co-occurring problems, and that alcohol actually makes the problem worse. So the initial attempt to medicate your symptoms to get some relief from the PTSD actually puts you deeper and deeper into it. So when we talk about adolescent alcohol use, we also have to think what else is going on biologically in individuals of this age. And we all know that an 11-year-old is not a 13-year-old, is not a 15-year-old, and if you walk into any 6th grade classroom, you'll also know that a 12-year-old is not a 12-year-old, is not a 12-year-old. But what's going on is there's a lot of brain maturation. When I was a kid, we all thought the brain was pretty much done in childhood. But over the last few decades, we've learned that actually brain maturation goes well into a person's 20s. And the development of self-regulation is one of those things that starts to come online a little later than some of the other things. There are the hormonal changes. There's sexuality, romantic interests. There's a shift in reward sensitivity, and this has been described as if driving 50 miles an hour gave you a certain sense of stimulation, now when you hit adolescence, you have to go 70 to get that same effect. And that may play into the whole risk-taking, sensation-seeking impulsivity that's characteristic of adolescence. There's also environmental changes. Kids are moving from elementary school to middle school to high school. There's increased importance of peer affiliations. Your friends become really important, and what they think becomes really important. Kids are driving, and kids are being monitored less by adults. They're expected to kind of start to oversee themselves. So what's going on in the brain? And NIAAA is really interested in what's going on in the brain at this time because it speaks to two things. It speaks to the consequences that we may need to worry about of alcohol use at this time, and it also may help us understand why kids use alcohol. So early in adolescence, the limbic system, which governs emotions, comes online. So the signal to go do it, take that chance, is online early. Whereas the frontal lobes, which is the part that kind of goes, maybe not such a good idea, what else do I know about this situation, why wouldn't I do this, comes online much later. And so this creates a gap between that urge to go try and do something and that sense of, maybe I better consider this first. And what's going on in the frontal lobes are two things. So first of all, you're pruning, you're getting rid of some of the synapses. You know, it sounds a little counterintuitive, but that's actually to make the brain more efficient. And you're also myelinating the axons. So you're creating this myelin sheath around the axons, which is seen as an increase in the white matter. And these two things together give you a much more efficient brain. It makes certain tasks just kind of razor precision in the way the brain does them instead of more diffuse, which is characteristic of earlier adolescence. So what happens now when you put alcohol in the mix? Well, right now we have a lot of data from cross-sectional studies. So a lot of these are looking at kids who've already initiated drinking. And what you see is alcohol use in adolescence locks in the cues that are associated with drinking. So now, this is something that becomes really salient to you, really important to you. This is what your brain wants. This is something that it thinks is important. It also disrupts the frontal lobes, which are responsible for that decision-making and impulse control and regulation of the limbic system. It disrupts the hippocampus, which is involved in memory formations. It's disruptive of the amygdala, which is responsible for fear and anxiety, and brainstem, which is important for vital functions. So too much alcohol is what we read about in the newspapers, the cases of coma and death from alcohol poisonings. Over the long term, alcohol can disrupt the trajectory of brain development and lead to cognitive deficits. But the problem is these are cross-sectional studies. These are kids who have initiated alcohol use. So the question then becomes, well, what of these things predated the alcohol exposure, and might be a good marker for who might have a problem when they initiate alcohol, and which of these things is actually the result of it. So NIAAA has a multi-site prospective longitudinal study looking at kids before they begin to drink and following them through the time where some kids will initiate alcohol use. And it's following over 800 kids, and we're getting some really interesting data out of it. We're also learning that in some cases, female brains are different from male brains in the way that alcohol affects them. And I'm just going to give you one example, not so much to focus on the details, but just to show you that in certain regions of the brain, in this case, in the frontal lobe volume, that non-drinker girls the heavy drinking girls have a reduced frontal lobe volume. And we don't see this in the boys. And we don't know why yet. Now, what we're doing is trying to follow these kids, but what would be great is then to have an even bigger study and to look at what other substances are doing and how substances in combination affect the developing brain. And so we have just launched an initiative to follow 10,000 youth over 10 years to get that kind of information. And this is in partnership with other institutes and centers at the NIH. It's far too big and far too expensive for one institute to do by itself. So this brain development piece also factors into decision making and why kids may begin to initiate and escalate alcohol use during this time. And so this immaturity of cognitive processing may lead to risky decisions. But we also know that risk-taking is actually evolutionarily built into adolescence, that you're supposed to take a risk. You're supposed to go out into the world. You're supposed to eventually be an independent being who goes far enough away from the fold to find a mate outside the family unit and to be responsible. And I think if you told any 12-year-old that, they would go put their head under the covers and not come out. So we're evolutionarily built to take some risks. It's just that unfortunately alcohol fits too well into that. We also know that strong emotions can override rational decisions. Any kid put into a classroom answering questions about how they should respond in certain situations can do that just fine. But you put him into a situation where the stakes are higher and everybody's excited and let's go do this, then the decisions change. And we also know that the presence of peers, and I'm not talking about deviant peers, I'm just talking about peers, influences decision making. And Larry Steinberg and his colleagues, quite a few years ago now, did a really cool study. They had a simulated driving task on the computer, and kids and adults were told to drive along, and at some point a yellow light comes on telling them that a wall will pop up and you're supposed to go as far as possible without hitting the wall, and if you hit the wall you lose all your points. Well, if you have an adult doing that over here and a kid doing that over here and an adolescent, they do about the same on this task. There's not really a difference. But when they're each allowed to bring a friend into the room, that's when things change and the adolescents take much more risks. So recently, they've, with new technology and all, they've gotten much more sophisticated in how they do this. They now put the person doing the task into an MRI scanner. And they look at the brain. And they see what's going on when they're doing the task. And what's kind of amazing to me is now the peer who's watching isn't even in the same room as the person doing the task. But the adolescent knows that their friend is watching them do this. And amazingly enough, the risk-taking still goes up. And what's interesting is the regions of the brain that are making sense of social cues, our reinforcement and activity, are lighting up like crazy. The frontal lobes, which are the decision-making, not so much. We also have reason to believe that adolescents may respond differently to alcohol than adults. So everyone, when they drink, the top little blip on the curve just basically shows that everybody, when you drink, at low levels gets this stimulating effect of alcohol. You have the disinhibition, the social facilitation, talking to everyone at a party, having a good time. And at some point, then that as you drink more and more, you start to feel the sedating effects of alcohol. And you may get a little impaired, a little off balance, the motor coordination starts to go. But it seems that adolescents are actually more sensitive to this social facilitation, less sensitive to the sedating effects, and so maybe inclined to drink more because they don't have the cues that would tell you and I, wow, after a drink or two, I'm happy, I'm done. And so also with the steepness of the curve, as your blood alcohol increases, it doesn't take too much for you to get into that danger zone of coma and even death. So what can we do? And this is where you all come in. And I appreciate the Surgeon General's remarks that it takes more than physicians and that they're not always the people that others listen to, but we know adolescents do listen to the physicians and that you are a credible source of information and you are an unbiased adult, unlike the parents are perceived. But 82% of teens report that they've seen a doctor at least once in the past year. Only 54% of those were asked anything about drinking, and of those who said they were drinking, only 17% were advised to either stop or reduce their drinking. So NIAAA has created something to help. We've created a youth alcohol screening guide, and it's very easy to use. It's 2 simple questions. One asks about friends drinking, one asks about frequency of their own drinking. And what we found is, believe it or not, this developmentally is appropriate for 11 through 17-year-olds. So you tweak the question slightly and you change the order of the questions, but they work pretty well and they have actually very good specificity and sensitivity in terms of picking up alcohol problems and risk for problems. So screening, does a lot of things. It not only finds problems, but it also opens up the conversation. And it indicates that you care about this issue and that you think it's as important as a bicycle helmet and other things you talk about. The screening guide helps you assess the risk depending on the age of the kid and the response to the questions, and then has advice of what to do. And this is just the simple guts of it, but there's a whole guide around it that helps with issues of when to break confidentiality, how you do a brief intervention, how you do a referral handoff. And so we're hoping that this will encourage physicians to screen their patients, and this was done in conjunction with the American Academy of Pediatrics and endorsed by them. We also have 6 studies in the field evaluating the guide in multiple settings. We're also very interested in reducing and preventing college drinking. Please stay tuned. Late this summer, early fall, we will be reducing our college alcohol intervention matrix. And this was done because college presidents told us we need an easy way to evaluate the things out there and not just do what seems the easiest to do or sounds good. And so we've spent a lot of time and engaged a lot of experts to evaluate these interventions, and not just by what they work, what works, but what do they work for, what specific outcomes, how much does it cost, how hard is it to do, and how do we, what kind of personnel do we use. So the good news is that drinking in general, the prevalence is going down among adolescents. The bad news is the high intensity drinking is going up, and the girls drinking is not going down at the same rate as guys. We're very concerned because the brain is vulnerable at this point, and we're seeing consequences on brain development, and we're going to learn a lot more over the coming years with these 2 longitudinal studies. So basically, we need your help. We're here to help you. We're happy to be the credible source of science-based information on alcohol. Let us know what we can do for you. And just to remind you, this is just a little piece of what we do. We deal with alcohol across the lifespan. And thank you so much for your attention and sticking around.